Buenas and Hafaday, the Committee of the Whole is back from recess. We remain in discussion on Bill number 325-36 COR as amended. We are now in the third round, and we will invite Congressman Michael Nicholas to join us. Members of the body may use their last round, their 5 minutes, to address the Congressman with any questions, as well as provide their final comments and amendments. So please bring the Congressman in.
Madam Chair, just a point of inquiry. I thought the additional panel members were supposed to be here as well.
Thank you, Senator Addo. We have reached out to them, and we are waiting for their response. But we do have the Congressman with us now. So we will proceed.
Thank you,
Madam Chair, point of inquiry.
State your point of inquiry, Senator Duenas.
Yeah, when we contemplated the Congressman's arrival, I believe that we were considering that we were still in the second round because of his arrival. We should have 5 minutes to ask the Congressman questions and then move into our final round in the third round. I object to this procedure. I believe you should give us the courtesy of 5 minutes for the Congressman and our 5-minute closing and amendments.
Okay, so you can make the motion, Senator Duenas.
Point of inquiry as well.
State your point of inquiry, Senator Tydegui.
Madam Chair, with the Congressman being here and for us to ask questions, there would be no need for us to go through the third round with amendments that we have to proffer, having the Congressman having to sit through every one of us when we're discussing our amendments. We could be able to excuse the Congressman and then go into the third round to do our amendments. So, I mean, that's, I think, would be the best way to move forward and ask that this body consider that as well.
Thank you. So you or Senator Duenas can make the motion to provide an additional round for questions for the Congressman.
So, Madam Chair, at this time I move that we consider our questioning of the Congressman a continuation of the second round for the purposes of using our 5 minutes each to question the Congressman, and then our final round should be our additional 5 minutes for amendments and comments on the bill before we rise from the Committee of the Whole. That's a motion. No, that's the, sure. So the amended motion is a additional 5 minutes in the third round for the questioning of the Congressman, separate from our third round 5 minutes for amendments and comments.
Okay. There's been a motion to add an additional round of 5 minutes for each senator for questions for Congressman Nicholas. Any objection?
Madam Chair, I'd like to add an amendment to that we wait for the administration to provide one of the representatives here in reference to the use of ARP money, because that's what the question is for. All right? Sure. And I already contacted them. I'm waiting for somebody to show up.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I don't object to that because that seems to be fair, as long as we're going to keep it in the context of the 5 minutes so that we can ask both the administration representative and our Congressman if the potential exists that they have two separate views in terms of the use of the funding. So I think that's a fair amendment to the amendment.
I object.
There's been an objection to the amendment.
It's going to take so much more time. We've already heard from the administration last week. The entire time they were here unopposed. We don't need to have a back and forth. We've heard them. They oppose it. We've heard very clearly what they say about the rules, and so now let's just hear from the Congressman and be done with the questioning.
Are you objecting to the motion or to the amendment to the motion? There's been an objection to the amendment to the motion. All those in favor of the amendment to the motion to allow for the administration to join us in the Committee of the Whole, please raise your hand. The amendment to the motion is to allow for the representatives from the administration to join us in the Committee of the Whole.
Madam Chair, we've invited them to join us, and I don't mind them joining us. I just don't want to wait any longer for them. If we're all waiting here since 10 o'clock this morning to begin this, and we have the Congressman here waiting. I don't want to wait for the administration any longer.
So all those in favor?
The question is all in favor of the amendment to the motion, right?
Yes, all those in favor
Okay.
of the amendment to the motion to allow us to wait for a representative from the administration to join us with the congressman in the committee of the whole for a round of questions, please raise your hand. Amendment fails. So we are on the original motion. We are on the original motion to allow for an additional round of 5 minutes for questioning with the congressman here. All of those, are there any objections? Hearing none, we will proceed. Okay. Can we please have the Sergeant at Arms swear in the congressman?
Congressman, if you can please raise your right hand. Under penalty of perjury, do you affirm that any and all information provided today, whether it be verbally, electronically, and in writing, be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you, Congressman. You may proceed, Madam Chair, under oath.
Situs Masi, Sergeant at Arms. We'll begin with the third round of questions, 5 minutes for each senator, starting with the author of the bill. Senator San Augustine, you are recognized.
And as that be last. Thank you.
Senator Rigel. Senator Brown.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and certainly, Congressman, thank you very much for taking the time I'd requested last week when we were meeting with regards to this emergency session to find funding to address offsetting the power bill cost of our residents last week. If you could come down, and I appreciate you responding to join us today to be able to elaborate. It's almost been a couple of weeks since you made your State of the Congress address, and you had outlined during that time that we should prioritize the use of federal funding, that you have certainly assisted our community in being able to acquire, to be able to rebuild and recover as a result of this pandemic. And so I thought it would be appropriate, because the administration was here last week informing us that we could not use federal funds specifically this round to deal with our power bills, to be able to offset that cost. And I certainly wanted to provide you the opportunity to explain to us, and certainly our people out there, just elaborate further on your comments you made during your State of the Congress address, that we could use the federal funds, because certainly if those funds, we know they're there, we would like to prioritize that and use it, as you relayed, for its intended purpose, to help our people recover from this pandemic. So thank you again for coming, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to give us some feedback with regards to your view with regards to the federal requirements on the use of these federal monies. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Brown. And first, if I may begin by just thanking the legislatura for making the efforts to try and bring more relief to our people. These circumstances that they are all enduring, stemming from the pandemic and continuing on to this very day, are very difficult for them. And this conversation to try and bring utility relief to them is, I think, something that everyone in the community is looking forward to. And any way that we can meaningfully contribute to helping all of you make a decision is a small honor for us. So thank you all very much for having us. I will stand ready to answer any specific questions, but I did want to just, I guess, open by saying I don't really have anything personally more to add other than what you've already had in front of you, and that is the interim final rule from Treasury. And in the interim final rule from Treasury, it is very clear in black and white. And I brought it down with me, and I have it open here on page 6 and page 7, highlighted, and I can read it into the record if you'd like. The Coronavirus State Local Fiscal Recovery Funds is available to support the COVID-19 public health and economic response by addressing COVID-19 and its impact on public health, as well as addressing economic harms to households, small businesses, nonprofits, impacted industries, and the public sector. And then it goes on specifically on page 7 to read, eligible uses for assistance to impacted households include aid for reemployment, job training, food, rent, mortgages, utilities, affordable housing development, child care, early education, addressing learning loss, and many more uses. So the interim final is very clear. The funds can be used for utility relief. I know that in some of the notes that we took when reviewing some of the statements from the administration, it was very pointedly stated that we cannot fund utility program with American Rescue Plan funds because rate hikes are a consequence of the Ukraine war. I know that the Ukraine war was being cited by the administration. And truth be told, if we do go to Treasury and say we're trying to fund anything as a result of Ukraine or inflation or any other purpose other than COVID-19 relief, then of course Treasury will come back and say, no, you can't do that because these funds were specific to COVID-19 relief. However, if we go to Treasury and we say we want to use these funds for utility relief in line with the authorized purposes to respond for COVID-19, Treasury of course will say, yeah, it's in black and white. Please feel free to do that. Just to further elaborate, the IRS also has issued clarity on its frequently asked questions to taxpayers on how they are supposed to consider any utility relief funding that they received from the state and local fiscal recovery funds, and whether they need to handle those utility relief dollars that they've received in other states and territories in a unique manner when filing their taxes. And long story short, IRS clarified that that is similar to every other form of COVID-19 relief. It doesn't need to be counted towards your taxable income. But we have clarity from Treasury that it can be used for utility relief. We have clarity from IRS that it has been used, and providing further guidance on how taxpayers were to handle the receipt of those funds. So this is not theoretical, it's in practice. It's been done elsewhere, and I know Legislature is considering whether to use local funds or federal funds for this utility relief program. As you mentioned in my address, I've stated that we should be using federal dollars as much as possible, but that's a policy decision of the Legislature. We did make our case during that address as to how the use of local funds is actually less restrictive, and so when we have actual authorizations to use federal dollars for specific relief programs, we should use those dollars that we can put our less restrictive funds to uses other than what's limited by the federal guidelines. And just to be clear again, the federal guidelines have made it very specific that utility relief is an eligible expense for coronavirus relief funding.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I certainly appreciate you coming today and providing that clarification because, I mean, over the past, at least my time here in the last year and a half, I mean, we really don't have a clear breakdown on how the federal funding has been spent. We do receive a listing of department and agencies, and they'll put how much money they've received, how much money they've spent, how much money is remaining, but we don't have specifics on how those dollars are spent. And yet we also see the governor still holding on to $300+ million of that. Of course, she has relayed she wants to keep that for a hospital, and I think we all would desire to have a new hospital. Maybe there's a time and place. We didn't expect this pandemic to continue. Now we're in year 3. And yet we still see the greater need out there. The adverse economic impact to our community, while the federal money has certainly provided more money to our local coffers, everything else for our people, the cost is going up and the quality of life is deteriorating as a result of it. So I agree with you. I'm of the position we should use and prioritize federal money as it was intended. I'm sure when we look at funding a new hospital, certainly early on it sounded good, but as this pandemic still continues, I mean, we have members of our community that are still being affected by COVID. The governor still on a monthly basis continues to declare an emergency every single month, unilaterally, because majority members of this body refuse to ensure that the government is accountable and have the people have a say in that process. So I think it's a priority that we should use that funds, and the administration has hoarded this $300 million with the explanation that they're going to use it for a hospital, that's their priority. But I agree with you. I think the priorities that are facing our people now, where they're feeling that financial crunch, just going grocery shopping, getting the most basic of things they need, and now on top of that, the fuel costs are going up, and now again, the cost of power, the most basic need of power, utilities are going up. So I support your position. I think that this body should prioritize the federal funding and force the administration. I mean, it's very easy for the governor to come up here and tell the legislature and tell the people of Guam, oh, I'm going to offset your power bill $100 for the next 5 months conveniently to end in November. I can't imagine what's happening in November. And yet give pay raises without reservation, without consultation with this body publicly or anyone else on the long-term financial impacts when it's convenient, and yet with things that directly will affect and benefit our people with the use of those federal funds. She's hesitant and wants the legislature now to come forth and use, as you mentioned, our precious local funds that we know in the next year or two as time goes on and these federal monies decrease, we're going to have less money circulating here in our community to help with the most basic critical needs of services that we need to provide our people. And so I certainly concur. Again, thank you very much for coming down and taking the time and also providing, again, I know you're elaborating further on your State of the Congress address, but I think it's important to get that message out and having it heard directly from our congressional representatives. So thank you very much, Mr. Congressman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Senator Atta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd just like to thank the Congressman as well for being here, offering his time to give us a clarification and on the rules for the use of the ARP funding. And you were mentioning, Mr. Congressman, that those were the interim rules. Do you have the final rules with you as well, or because I know I got a copy of the final rules, the final rule overview, and it states that the final rule takes effect on April 1st, 2022. Until that time, the interim final rule remains in effect. Funds used consistently with the IFR while it is in effect are in compliance with the SLFRF program. And in this, on the final rule overview on page 18, I believe it is, it says, Treasury recognizes the enumerated projects below, which have been expanded under the final rule, as eligible to respond to impacts of the pandemic on households and communities. And one of those is emergency housing assistance, rental assistance, mortgage assistance, utility assistance, once again stated in the final rule. So it seems to me, Congressman, that both in the interim rule and the final rule, that utilities is allowed under this program. Is that
That is correct, Senator. I apologize if I misspoke when I spoke earlier. I am quoting the final rule. So yes, we are reading the same document, sir.
Yeah, so your final rule that you have in front of you and the final rule that I have in front of me comes from the same Treasury Department, right?
Yes, sir. That is the same.
So,
source.
and that's why I just wanted clarification, because according to the director, Ed Byrne, that it's not allowed. So I'm just trying to figure out which final rule is he looking at, because obviously we're in sync here of the final rules that we're both looking at, and utility assistance is an allowable expense under the final rule.
Very clearly, yes. Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate it. Once again, I appreciate your time and the clarification that you've given us on this final rule, and hopefully the administration will pick up on it and know that this is an allowable expense again under the final rule. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sitos Masi, Senator Atta. Senator Moylan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Congressman, for your time and your presence here with us. Within the last just few minutes, you were able to clarify information that we were asking the previous panel that couldn't read to us, where it says, well, we couldn't. It was direct questions that was posed by my colleagues to say, read to us where you can't use that. And they said it's a matter of interpreting the final rules and how they're written, and they feel they cannot do it. Nor could they answer to us, well, how are other states then able to do this? How is our sister island, CNMI, able to do this? You also pointed out that there was a question on the taxation of the money as well. That was answered by the federal government, that you don't have to, you're using the money for your utilities bills. You don't have to pay taxes. So I truly appreciate you explaining this clearly, reading from the rule books, and instead of us, what we last experienced in a few rounds going in circles, what you read for us is truthful and honest and very transparent. And that's what I needed to hear. So in my understanding now, it's just the choice of the administration not to want to use the federal money. But we can use the federal money. The interim guidelines said yes. The final guidelines said yes. My colleague just previously for me said we got the same final guidelines, and that's final. We can use ARPA funds for this bill as priority if this administration will do so. So I'm not too trusting of what this administration is going to do when I didn't get the answers clearly initially when we had them before us. So I have no questions. I'm very clear on what you had to state for us, and I'm very appreciative of you coming down and taking your time with us. So thank you, Mr. Congressman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Moylan. Senator Dueñas.
Cesar Masi, Madam Chair, and to your Congressman, welcome back to the People's House, where you served honorably. So glad to have you here today, and I appreciated a number of different things that you pointed out in your State of the Congress address and congressional address, and I particularly appreciate your discussion on this issue. You know, Congressman, it's kind of interesting how we're kicking around this $300 million, but yet there's over $500 million still unexpended, obligated but unexpended. I remember when you were part of this body, you were very much astute and attuned to priorities. What are your priorities? I don't even see a problem to reprogram some of that 500 is what it really is, 500 plus. We have the sheet because this legislature that you would be proud of insisted that we get a monthly report in terms of the tracking of the federal funds and what programs they've been attributed to. But there's not just $300 million in the bank, Mr. Congressman, there's over $500 million still in the bank. I know mayors have discussed, their challenges with being promised that 17 plus million and still having to basically wait for it to be, leaked out to them. So I just wanted to make sure you also understand that in that context, Congressman. I don't know how closely you've been following our reporting requirements, but we'll be happy to send you a copy. I guess, Congressman, I'm going to ask this question in reverse. Do you see anything in the final rules that would concur with the administration as a disallowed cost for this program?
I think the problem is how the administration is characterizing the impetus for using the funds. And I know that the administration testified that the need for utility relief, at least the position they're taking, is the need for utility relief is as a result of the war in Ukraine and as a result of inflation and the impacts of those on fuel prices and on supply costs and how those increases are creating challenges in our community, and that's why we're trying to do this to respond to those particular challenges. And that is where I think the problem lies with the administration. Because if they go to Treasury and they say, can we use COVID relief money to respond to the war in Ukraine, Treasury will say no, because that's specifically for COVID relief. So, and I think that this is an example of how the administration kind of shot themselves in the foot with PUA over a year ago, because they were over-interpreting federal regulations that caused them to take away PUA from reduced hours workers on island. And they kept coming back to me saying, Congressman, you need to change the regs, you need to change the regs. I kept going back to the administration, as in the U.S. government. The U.S. government kept coming back to me saying, Guam is the only one doing that to its population. I don't know why Guam's doing that. And then I went back to the committee and I said, hey, committee, is there anything in the committee language that is justifying my administration taking away PUA from our reduced hours workers? And they said, no, Guam is the only one doing that. So I went back to our local administration and said, guys, this is not happening anywhere else in the country. Why are we doing this to our own people? The local administration, Department of Labor, Guam Department of Labor, kept insisting that, no, those regs need to change. So in order for us to satisfy our own local over-interpretation of things, I had to call in a lot of help congressionally. I had to work with the U.S. government to add a regulation interpretation into the write-up, and they were kind of coming back to us saying, are you really calling us in to do this for you? And I said, look, my local government isn't going to turn this back on until we do this, and I know that you're saying we don't have to, but can you just do it? Otherwise, we won't get PUA for our people on the local side. They won't pay it. So long story short, we got that done, and it wasn't necessary. And so in this instance, I think the administration is making the same mistake. They're going to Treasury saying, can we use this money for Ukraine? And of course you can't. But you can use this money to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are nowhere near economic recovery. Our unemployment rates are highest among those across the nation. Our tourism is nowhere near where it needs to be. There is no reason why we cannot use this money under the premise of providing additional COVID-19 relief for our community. And that's how the administration needs to be encapsulating the question when they put it to Treasury. Because going to Treasury and saying, can we use it for Ukraine, Treasury is going to say no. And of course, no. This was COVID-19 relief money. So I think they need to recalibrate how they're communicating with the federal government, if they are at all, and ask the question in the proper way. Can we use these resources to respond to COVID-19? Can we do a utility relief program as part of our COVID-19 response? And the answer unequivocally will be yes.
And I thank you for that, Congressman, because I also wanted to make one observation that you'll probably concur with. This is by no means a political statement. It is the grizzle of Washington. But the main debate is, with fuel prices going up and now even coming down, is that was happening prior to the Ukraine war. So I'm sure the power bills that the people of Guam are paying are a result of several increases that predated the discussion on what the impact of the Ukraine war was. As a matter of fact, what we've done is gone and tried to find all other spigots to turn on to provide oil. So this, I agree with you, Congressman, and I just wanted to see if you had one final comment on that, and I'll close with a final question is, I mean, that seems like that's what we're doing here, is actually setting ourselves up for failure on this issue, because the precedence was already set. $15 million was spent to avoid an increase prior to saying it's Ukraine. Now it's like we're trying to make it Ukraine. That doesn't make any sense. We're asking for a violation. So in a sense, I just wanted to see if you concur and just confirm that that is the debate in Washington as well. Like I said, everybody wants to take credit for prices coming down. I'll let that politics be what it may. But in terms of going up, this scale of escalation of fuel prices, which has affected oil, inflation, and everything else, has been going on for over 18 months. This declaration of Ukraine and what's happened in Ukraine and what Russia has decided to do with regard to its flow of resources would you concur, is an isolated incident?
I would very much concur, and I think the way we can really help the administration to look at this is to help them to understand that the supply chain constraints existed as a result of COVID. Now, yes, the war in Ukraine is exacerbating supply chain challenges, but those supply chain challenges were already there, and so we don't need to go to Treasury and say we're using this for Ukraine relief. We can clearly say we're using this for COVID-19 relief. And I wanted to also just touch on another point you made, Senator, that was very, very astute about the full $500 million and the ability to reprogram. And I just wanted to courteously remind you, Legislature, there's also several hundred million in GDOE that they received from the American Rescue Plan. I know that they paid some of that out in a one-time payment for their non-educator staff. I know they did a pay raise for their educators. I believe that there's still over 100 million also in GDOE. That they're looking to program as well, and they're running up against the same timelines that the current administration is running up against on the 300 million. The need to obligate it by 2024 and expend it by 2026. There's just so many things we can do if we had greater coordination, interagency, administration, legislature. We can be funding the utility relief with the 300 million or reprogramming some of the 500 million as you suggested. We can also tag team with DOE and say, hey, Have you guys fully obligated your 100 million, your 200 million? Because now if we marry these resources, you guys can give utility relief to DOE employees, we can fill the gap on the rest of the island, and then all of a sudden we're balancing the books across the board. And that can really help everybody to maximize utilization of resources, prevent having to return any money at the end of the deadlines when these funds expire. And I wanted to emphasize that if that time comes, 2024 or 2026, and we do not obligate or expend these monies and we return them, not only do we lose out on a tremendous opportunity to deploy federal dollars into our community and help our community, but we are creating a problem for ourselves in the future, because if a circumstance like this were to reemerge and there was another individual sitting in the congressional seat advocating for Guam, and they were advocating for full inclusion and 100% funding for the island the way we did, they may go back and they may look at our expenses and they may say, you know, you only spent 75% of what you got last time, so we're just going to give you 75% this time. And then we're right back into that trap of us saying, hey, but what about us? Give us the same, we're equal, we're Americans, making the whole case all over again, but the numbers don't justify the argument. So this conversation that we're having about using federal resources, as much as it can be misconstrued as a political conversation, this is really a fiscal conversation. And the need for us to not only make sure we're using federal dollars when we can and not using local dollars when we don't have to, but looking ahead and not making that very big mistake of not fully expensing what we receive federally and returning things back to the federal government. And I just wanted to kind of point out to Legislatura, that's happening already. I know that it happened on the rental assistance. I know that we've returned a lot of money there. There's certain other funding rounds that would have been eligible for expense that I know we have not capitalized on. And this is outside of the American Rescue Plan. This is also with regards to the recently passed infrastructure law. There was a $1 billion allocation for airports that I don't think we captured. We have another $500 million coming out for public transportation that I don't know if we're going to capture. So these opportunities for us to make full use of federal resources, again, is not as much of a political conversation as it is a fiscal one, and it has a lot to do with how we're going to situate our future congressional representative when they want to advocate for Guam in the event that circumstances like this were to repeat. Because if the numbers come back and it shows that we were 100% funded, but we only spent 75% of the funds, we're setting ourselves up to receive less in the future, and that's something we really want to prevent from happening.
My final observation, Congressman, and I know that many businesses were very irritated with this, but of course, under the current climate, they couldn't make it known. But we did this with the local employment assistance program. And I just think it was wrong, because what we did was we made this legislature have to go forward and appropriate money as a match to a program that has a bank account loaded with money in it. And that LEAP is designed to shore up and try to maintain our tourism industry, our tourism businesses that have to be here as our guests are returning now. And that's the particular, I guess, stick in my craw, Congressman, because to me, and I just wanted to get your observation on this final thought process, is when you have that federal money and you have the alacrity to be able to get it out there, to me, a relief delayed is relief denied. And I just wanted to see if you had the same thought process.
The timing is so important. The sooner it gets out, the sooner it circulates. The use or the requirement that was put before Legislatura on the LEAP program to match, we were observing that with great disappointment, because there are federal grants out there that require matching funds, and I remember during our time working together, this budget process will always require us to scrounge around and do our very best to find the local dollars just to capture the match. Here we were forcing ourselves to match, and there was no requirement from the federal government to match the expenses that ultimately rolled out in the LEAP program. As a matter of fact, it's my understanding that the LEAP program continues to be funded now entirely federally without any matching local dollars. It's also my understanding that while there was a local appropriation provided for LEAP, it was not proportionally dispersed to the recipients of LEAP. And so, for example, if the 25 million was a dollar for dollar match. The recipients did not receive 50 cents federal, 50 cents local. We created a hurdle for ourselves that ended up expending our own local dollars that we didn't need to. And it also created the delay in getting those resources out. Because if there was no requirement for local appropriation for LEAP, and it was just entirely federally funded, the administration has 100% of the authority to go out and spend that. So coming to a legislatura, asking for local dollars, spending local dollars that weren't necessary, requiring a match that wasn't necessary, was all a delay in getting out the LEAP money to those recipients. And we're seeing the same thing with this question, because this issue of are we going to use local dollars for utility relief, when it's very clear you can use federal dollars for utility relief. All the days that we spent debating this issue were days that could have actually had dollars getting into the pockets of the recipients that this entire conversation is intended to provide relief to.
Jesus Mossy, Congressman, and my closing comment is that, you know, when we give rate relief to the people, they now have more disposable income. That's what stimulates our economy. And getting that rate relief to them as soon as possible and spending $100 less on power means providing $100 more to take care of your children, to buy school supplies, to do what you need to do in that money to shore up our businesses. So don't delay, just get the money out there. Jesus Mossy, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Duenas. Senator Torres.
Congressman, I'm listening intently to the discussion and the questions that are coming forward, and I just want to ask you, over the course of time, as the rates have been going up and, you know, the general public has been listening to commentary by GPA, who is, as you're aware, an autonomous agency that has its own supervisory boards. A lot of the discussion about what is going on with our rates have had to do, I thought, with the circumstances in Russia and Ukraine and the war, and, you know, how that has compounded and affected the pricing of fuel nationwide and worldwide. So I just wanted to ask a very simple question, just from the perspective of the everyday ratepayer on Guam. We have been made to understand that a lot of what's happening in the fluctuation in gas prices and fuel prices has to do with that situation in Russia. Would you proffer that GPA and the board would be agreeable to an opinion, your opinion, for example, that it's just a matter of justifying, of putting down the justification for a relief payment using the federal funds, that it would be as simple as that? Because I see as a ratepayer, there's a bit of a confusion there, because on one hand, you say it's a matter of how you present it. If you present it as COVID-related, and you package it that way, and you finesse the language that way, it'll fly. But if you defer to, well, it's a circumstance that really is not COVID-related, it's more related to the war in Ukraine and how that has made the situation with fuel supplies and prices, aggravated it, then it won't fly. So, I mean, is it as simple as that? Because I think where I'm a little conflicted is when the panel before you, we had the OPA, he in his opinion, the public auditor also agreed that maybe if we were to pay this out of federal funds, it could be a question cost, and why take that risk? So I'm just wondering how to reconcile that, because we now have the power authority with their autonomy in their board with an opinion, which I think is almost separate and apart from the administration, because they really are the lead in terms of that opinion. You've got the OPA, and now you've got your position. So I'm just trying to reconcile that, and how would you address that? Is it as simple as language, or is that audit proof?
That's a very good question, Senator. I think it's very important for us to really zero in on that. If the position of the administration and even the public auditor is we should not use federal money for this because it can be the cost increases in GPA can be associated with the war in Ukraine, then that means that we are going to be tying our hands to every other relief dollar that we spend right now, because everything has been impacted by Ukraine. And so technically, even the hospital that the governor wants to set aside the money for to build, we wouldn't be able to use relief money for that using the same logic, because the cost for those materials has gone up as a result of the war in Ukraine. So we need to be extra careful that we aren't tying our hands in the future on all federal spending as a result of us trying to just create the argument for this round of funding. Because then, if all of this is on the record, that the administration could not spend any federal dollars for utility relief because it was due to Ukraine, are we going to open the door now for the Inspector General of the Treasury to come back and say, well, if you were already concerned more about Ukraine than COVID when it came to spending for this instance, why was that factor not considered when you spent for that instance, or this other instance, or for this next instance? So, and that's why when I observe this and the position the administration's taking, it's one thing for you to want to come down and win the argument. It's another thing entirely for you to shoot yourself in the foot. And it's just happened too often, and it's been so disappointing. But if the argument today is we cannot use this federal relief to address COVID-19 and utility costs associated with that, because Ukraine has created a new variable, Ukraine has created a variable across the board. And so we're going to be endangering every future federal expense, because the same argument can be applied to every other relief dollar that goes out from this day forward, if that's the justification for us not using relief dollars in this particular instance.
But I would respectfully disagree with that, because nothing is all attributable to one factor. And we know that COVID presented a supply chain challenge across the world, where factories were shut down, not producing materials, everything was in short demand, people were getting sick, not being able to process goods, not being able to man certain transportation entities. So I think to some extent, I see your point, but I also think that there is no such thing as a catch-all. I think what is difficult about this bill is we've gotten so far into the weeds in terms of understanding the cause and effect of things, and the ramifications of not using one source over another, prioritizing, and that's all good for discussion purposes. But I think in some respects, we've sort of gone so far off of the baseline, which was a simple relief for utilities using local funds, and then the question became, why not federal funds? So I think for purposes of Bill 325, we're either for this bill or we're not for this bill. And if the intent is to chase down federal dollars and use that, which you suggest, and I don't think any of us would disagree with that as a priority, then so be it. But in terms of what we can do as a legislature, we surely can't appropriate those funds. So we could only advocate that they be used if in fact it can be. And I thank you for your perspective. It's always good to have that well-rounded perspective. But I think in some cases there's so many players, and it's hard to just put your eggs into one basket entirely, because in fact, as we know, everything affects everything else, right? It's all one compounded situation with COVID and the war in Ukraine and everything else. But Susmasi, though, I like the candor. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Torres. Speaker Terlahi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Congressman, for being here today. I share the sentiments of my previous two colleagues and yours as well, that it is very much seeming like semantics, whether we are describing oil prices or the LIAC increases based on Ukraine, based on the pandemic. And it's so ironic that in 2021, $15 million in the ARP was perfectly legitimate to be used for GPA. Not questioned according to them. Are you aware of any question of that cost?
None to my knowledge, Speaker.
And that Congress itself has recognized utilities costs as being exacerbated by the fiscal impacts of the pandemic. That's so clear to me. And and that the administration cannot come up with a description of the impact to the households on Guam from the pandemic to our utility, or, and that we need relief in utilities is a little bit far-fetched to me. I'll just say it like that. It's very clear. Congress even recognized, yes, that if you're going to use pandemic funds, that they want it to be for programs, services. If a recipient identifies a harm or impact to a beneficiary or class of beneficiaries caused or exacerbated by the public health emergency or its negative economic impacts. And as the previous colleague explained, whenever we talk about gas prices before, all kinds of reasons came into why gas prices were so high. One of them is the war in Ukraine, but that was never the sole reason. And I guess that's what I'm questioning with this GPA now. It's like that is the sole reason for increasing gas prices. Gas prices have not, they've been increasing throughout the pandemic. And so that's why we all believed it was perfectly legitimate, and no one's questioned their use of the $15 million to GPA earlier. They've never questioned the use of ARP money for the program Salapit, which was particularly for gas, for just general household relief, for just cash relief for every household. And Congress, they said, they made a presumption, it looks to me, a presumption that households are presumed to be disproportionately impacted by the public health emergency or its negative economic effects if they are households and populations residing in the territories, households and populations receiving services provided by the territorial governments. And of course, in all other parts, they spell out all kinds of eligibility criteria. But this presumption seems to me to say all in the territories are presumed to be eligible. They are presumed to be impacted, just as those in low-income households across the nation. And so I want to give relief to the people of Guam. I think giving them utility relief is very much needed. It was needed months ago. The prices are not going down. GPA has said they're going to continue with their rate increases. They have a schedule of them. So I can't see why we can't. That's not related to the war in Ukraine. That was planned years ago, I think. And so I can't see why we can't give this type of financial relief, just as we have given financial relief to businesses and give financial relief to households in the past, that we can't give them. And every dime that we can save of our local funds just gives us more opportunity to use those, again, in dire need when there is no program coming out fast enough. And so, well, thank you, Mr. Congressman.
Thank you very much, Speaker Terlahi. Senator Titagui.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Congressman, or good morning. Thank you so much for being here. Greatly appreciated. It would have been nice to have the administration here as well, so that, I'd like to hear what they would have to say, but I think it's clear and precise. What you read to us earlier from the request of Senator Brown, and of course, Senator Atta's comments too, was clear and precise. And I ask Mr. Congressman, if you could please provide us a copy of that particular section that you read to this body and the listening audience, so we have a copy of that. I'm sure the media would also like a copy of it as well, so we'll be happy to provide it to them. You know, in the CNMI was brought up on it was similar, the distribution of federal relief funds to the CNMI. Was there any qualifications as far as income qualifications needed, or did they just give it out to everybody in the CNMI?
Thank you for the question, Senator, and that ties into the point that the speaker was making as well. On page 19 of the guidelines, the Treasury does specify what are regarded as disproportionately impacted households and communities. And if you look at it very specifically, the way it's laid out is it has certain itemizations of what they consider to be disproportionately impacted households and communities. One of them are low-income households and communities. That's one checkbox. Another checkbox, its very own checkbox, is households residing in the U.S. territories or receiving services from these governments. So the income threshold argument applies to everything else that's not a territory because it is its own itemized checkbox. So if you're living in Montana, Nebraska, Kansas, Kentucky, and they want to roll out relief under the particular section of disproportionately impacted households and communities, those areas would have the burden to demonstrate that there was a low-income household that's being considered as part of the relief that's being provided as a disproportionately impacted household and community. For Guam and for all the other territories, we were given our own special checkbox. So that checkbox was not in conjunction with being a low-income household or community. It was separate and apart. So for the mere fact that we are a household residing in a U.S. territory receiving services from these governments, we are automatically eligible as a disproportionately impacted community. And if anybody were to try to define that in any other way and say, oh no, low income is there, territory is there, well, the reverse holds true. Kansas, Kentucky, Nebraska, they would not be able to use this definition at all because they're not territories.
Right.
Okay, so again, you know, very—
It's an advantage that we have as a territory, and I think we should take it.
And so
Thank you.
we need to just be very, very careful about how we're going back and trying to over-extrapolate our own set of circumstances, because why are we going to continue to tie our hands when Treasury has given us a very, very clear document in black and white?
Thank you, Congressman. You know, Congressman, a lot of it has to do with this legislation is the concern I have with the general fund, you know, utilizing that. I mean, we're not going to be seeing this type of influx of federal funds, I don't think, for quite a while. And if it is, it's going to be competitive, you know, for Guam to go after these grants that are still available. But it's the funding that I'm concerned about, the roads that, the non-routed roads, the schools, the buildings that need addressing now with money that we can use from the general fund that cannot be used through the ARP funding. But, you know, first and foremost, this money was to help us relieve those who are impacted. And I don't care what war was going on, we have been impacted by a pandemic. Set aside everything else. As far as the PUC approving GPA's request for the 3 stages of price increases, rate increases, we've already experienced 2 so far, but PUC has not agreed to the 3rd price increase, rate increase was expected in November. So yes, these rates have been going on nonstop. Now, one of my biggest concerns, Congressman, is these federal award findings and questionable costs. We received from the auditor the single audit report where it's showing $41,668,920 in questionable cost. 23 million of that is, of course, from PUA, you know, and I'm not sure. I'm trying to get a hold of somebody at Department of Labor to determine if they are going to waive, if the federal government is going to waive this section of it. But my question would be, when are these funds, or are these costs going to be basically rectified to determine whether we have to pay this back or not? Because if you subtract 41, and then of course we're hearing that we're going to get waived for the PUA of 23 million, you have about a leftover $18 million. And how are we going to rectify these questionable costs or have to pay it back? Do you know how this is going to play out?
That is a very good question, Senator, and I believe that state and local governments across the country are going to be having to reckon with those kind of questions. But I see your point, and your point is that in light of these potential clawbacks that are going to materialize, are we going to have the local revenues in place to be able to fund those potential clawbacks? And that's actually a prudent question to ask, because if we expend, for example, this surplus amount on this program with local dollars when we could have used federal dollars, and those local dollars instead could have been used to offset any potential clawbacks that were spent in error that the federal government's requiring a reimbursement from, then we can use those local dollars to pay back whatever was misspent. If you exhaust this resource, you won't have that to pay back whatever is ultimately determined to have been misspent. Whether or not the full 41 million that's cited by the public auditor is going to materialize federally, I think is still up in the air. But I think it would be prudent of legislatura to kind of just have that in the back of their mind that, you know, there may be some paybacks that would be required. Setting aside funding for that may be prudent, because the ultimate outcome will be the feds are going to get it one way or the other. We've seen them do it with Section 30, and so that could potentially impact future federal flows from Section 30 if there is a clawback that we did not set aside funding for. So those are all very good questions, Senator. But again, it all boils right back down to how are we prudently managing federal resources and local resources? Because if we use local dollars to fund this, those local dollars aren't available to pay back whatever might be owed. And we can't use federal funds to pay back federal funds.
Exactly, and I think this is what the public auditor mentioned to us on Friday, that he's very cautious about using any funding locally because of this audit showing $41 million in questionable costs. I don't think he said anything about not being cautious to use federal funds. He was cautious about using local funds because of this particular audit. And it's very, very concerning. I think also, I've noticed too, Congressman, other states and territories having a rainy day fund. And I've looked at all the states. They all have some funding in a rainy day fund. Guam has zero in our rainy day fund right now. And if we're going to have to adjust even further on questionable costs, we sure can't use federal money to pay federal questionable costs, like you mentioned earlier. But my time is almost up. And Congressman, again, I thank you so much for clarifying it, not just for this body, but for the listening audience as well, that our fundings can be used for this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Titlegy. Senator Terlahi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank the Congressman for coming up today and sharing this information. You know, going through the issues on to give financial release to some of the categories that are being mentioned, I'm kind of leery, Congressman, on just what we can confirm as authorized and not authorized. So with that, I need to absorb more information from you regarding the spending of what is authorized for us to spend as here on the island. So I'll just yield for now.
Thank you, Senator Terlahi. Okay. Senator San Agustin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Congressman Snickles, for appearing, and thank you for your opinion, your interpretation of what you believe the rules are. But I would leave it to the administration, because they're the one that's going to end up accounting for it when the Treasury Department asks the questions, or the OPA. And with that, thank you. Thank you for visiting us again. All right? And you just have a nice day, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Congressman, for joining us. That completes the third round of questions, and we will take a brief recess. The Committee of the Whole is back from recess. Senator San Augustine, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Due to the numerous number of amendments, I'd ask that we recess till 2 o'clock p.m.
We are in recess until 2 p.m.